Tottenham Hotspur are a massive and successful football club. Now that might be a statement that draws both ire and titters from fans of other Premier League teams, and I can already feel several of you going to the comments to post, "I stopped listening when he said Spurs were a big club, cry laugh emoji, cry laugh emoji, cry laugh emoji." But in the grand scheme of things, it's true. They've been a permanent presence in the top flight of English football since the late 70s and haven't finished outside the top half of the Premier League since 2008. They've qualified for the Champions League in 5 out of the last 7 seasons and only once in that run failed to get into the knockout rounds. In fact, in the last decade, only 10 different teams have played in the Champions League final, and Spurs are one of them. They've got the spending power to match the division's top clubs, a brand new state-of-the-art stadium, an enormous global fan base, and should be one of the most attractive projects for any ambitious manager. Yet, somehow, they've been without one for well over 3 months. This is why nobody wants to manage Tottenham Hotspur. It's Daniel Levy. And that's it, that's the end of the video. Please do subscribe to 442 if you haven't already, and alright, fine, I'll do it properly. The appointment of Mauricio Pochettino at Chelsea was perhaps as significant for Tottenham as it was for their London rivals. Not because Spurs were ever considering a reunion with their former manager, those reports have long since been rubbished, but because even a club as seemingly dysfunctional and directionless as Chelsea had been able to simply go out and get a top manager. A cursory glance at the league table would imply that the problems at Stamford Bridge are considerably worse than those at the Tottenham Hotspur Stadium, but the truth is that behind the scenes there is more confusion, more disarray and more uncertainty. And it's thus an environment that managerial candidates are finding repellent. Early talks with Julien Nagelsmann broke down, only for the club to then begin immediately briefing that they weren't actually interested in him. A curious claim given they had already approached him twice before this. Firstly before bringing in Jose Mourinho, and secondly when he turned down the job to move to Bayern. Precisely who ended these talks we'll likely never know, but the club's transparent attempt to get ahead of the story certainly implies it wasn't wholly their decision. Then there was Arne Slot. The Feyenoord manager was publicly courted by the club in a very "look at us go, this is who we really want, watch us get him" PR move, only to then see him equally publicly sign a new deal with Feyenoord and announce how committed he was to that project. Reports emerging subsequently that he may even have entertained Tottenham's interest purely to strengthen his negotiating power for a new contract. A club the stature of Tottenham Hotspur should have managers knocking their door down for this job, but right now they can't even seem to get a text back. Why? Well, firstly, let's just rewind back here. It's Daniel Levy. On March the 26th, 2023, Antonio Conte was relieved of his duties as Spurs head coach following the comments he made in the wake of a simply staggering late collapse at bottom of the table Southampton. The club has the responsibility for the transfer market. And the players? Where are the players? 20 years there is the owner and they never won something. But why? The fault is only for the club. The point he was making in a roundabout way was that after 2 transfer windows he still didn't have the players he wanted. Conte famously likes his teams to play with a pragmatism and a directness that requires a very particular profile of footballer. Tottenham were neither blessed with that kind of player when he arrived, nor was Levy willing to alter his recruitment strategy to bring more of them in. Pedro Porro and Yves Bissouma were loose fits for Conte's system, but their biggest acquisition of that summer, the £50 million plus spent on bringing Richarlison over from Everton, could not have been more counterproductive if it had tried to be. The Brazilian started a meagre 7 league games under the Italian without scoring a single goal. His was a transfer like so many in the past that seemed to be directly at odds with either the stylistic or philosophical approach of the man ultimately tasked with managing them. Sergio Reguilon and Brian Gil, for example, were signed during Nuno Espirito Santo's short tenure, but were both identified by the club's former director of football months prior to his arrival. They're now, tellingly, both being loaned back to sides in La Liga. And if you need further proof, Conte literally referred to Jed Spence as a club signing when asked why he wasn't getting a game. While the Southampton outburst made his position entirely untenable, it merely hastened the exit that was no doubt coming when his contract expired this summer. In short, the club knew that it would be looking for a new manager right now, and yet have somehow been caught out by looking for a new manager right now. It's a situation that speaks not only to a lack of preparation, but to how unresolved the major issues at the club are. Take, for example, the director of football situation. Fabio Paratici was forced to resign from the club in April after his appeal to have his 8-month ban overturned, all relating to his time at Juventus and the quote-unquote financial mismanagement that went on there, was rejected. This, again, was not a huge shock to the club, and yet well over a month later, no replacement appointment has been made. Stop me if you've heard this one before, but Frankfurt's sporting director Markus Krösche was the latest in a line of candidates to be approached before turning the role down. Asking any manager to come into a club with this structure while the identity of their direct superior remains a mystery is a huge ask. But it's on the field uncertainty that's no doubt the bigger issue here. Spurs were staggeringly dependent on Harry Kane this past season, with their captain contributing 37 goals across the campaign and nearly half of all their goals in the league. While Harry Kane is good at goals isn't anything new, the fact that he needed to overperform his XG by nearly 10 illustrates that this was a frankly superhuman season, and had a mere mortal been on the receiving end of those chances, Tottenham could have finished significantly lower than the already disappointing 8th. At 29, there's every chance he can continue to be that lethal next season, but his contract situation is an enormous worry. It expires in 12 short months, and with no renewal on the horizon, Tottenham face an era-defining decision of whether to sell him now while he still commands a substantial transfer fee, or allow him to leave for nothing. There is an entire video in this on its own, but as far as it relates to this one, it's just another seismic question mark hanging over a club that any new manager would want resolved. And then there's the rest of the squad. Heung-min Son is now the wrong side of 30 and clearly struggled this season, so while any new manager will want to retain him, they'll know they need to work hard to help him rediscover his best form. Meanwhile, Hugo Lloris and Fraser Forster are the wrong side of 35, meaning that a new goalkeeper is likely an expensive necessity. Dejan Kulusevski is currently still only on loan from Juventus, and Spurs' failure to finish in the top 4 voided his mandatory purchase option. When asked about staying at the club, the player simply said, "I don't know, honestly, we'll see." And while reports are Spurs will renegotiate the fee required to keep him, that's potentially 20 or 30 million down the drain just to keep a player you already have. Likewise, Pedro Porro, who it's believed Spurs are obligated to buy this summer, will drain them of another estimated 35 to 40 million. That's something like 70 million out of any transfer budget before a new manager has even adjusted his office chair. And that's before you've even considered throwing Clement Longley into this equation, who'll be returning to Barcelona this summer unless a fee can be agreed. On the other side of this coin, Sergio Reguilon, Harry Winks, Giovanni Lo Celso, Joe Rodon, Brian Gil, Tanguy Ndombele, and the aforementioned Jed Spence are all potential first-team players who return from loan this summer with their futures completely up in the air. Uncertainty on a frankly staggering scale, and the worst possible scenario for a club in desperate need of a rebuild. How can any new manager plan an overhaul when the status of nearly 10 senior players is currently in flux? And then, finally, there is the scale of the job. No vacancy in football usually comes about because things at the club are going well, but even by the usual measure of problems, turning things around at Spurs is daunting in the extreme. You need to get the side back into Europe despite being financially dwarfed by your nearest rivals. You need to quickly instill a cohesive and effective brand of football despite having no idea what your squad will look like. You need to attract players of an improved quality despite not being able to offer them European football. You need to tame an allegedly dysfunctional dressing room despite the enormous personalities of Jose Mourinho and Antonio Conte not being enough to do so. And worst of all, you need to command the respect of a board, of a squad, and of a fan base despite the very public rejections of other candidates immediately marking you out as nobody's first choice. If that last one doesn't sound as significant, keep in mind it's precisely what happened to Nuno Espirito Santo just 2 short summers ago. The fact that we can point to a glaring example in the club's own very recent history, though, does show that all of these problems pale in insignificance next to their root cause: glaring mismanagement and a shocking lack of forward planning from the very top down. Ultimately, teams do play badly, managers will get sacked, players lose form and move away. These are all things that impact every club in the world, but the real measure is how well they're anticipated and how effectively they're addressed. Spurs, despite the incredible resources at their disposal, have spent their last few years doing neither, and until they address that themselves, there won't be a single manager worth appointing who'll be willing to come in and clean up their assorted messes for them. In short, nobody wants to manage Tottenham Hotspur right now because those at the very top of the club have made them unmanageable.